You don't know what you're talking about, darling. Leave the business strategy to me. My husband, Ricardo's voice was low but sharp. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. We were at a black tie fundraising gala. Ricardo, the CEO of Novatech Solutions, was in the middle of an animated conversation with the board of an investment bank. I had just politely corrected a number he cited about the renewable energy market. A number I knew was wrong. He patted my hand, a condescending little pat-pat. Eliza is an academic, he said to the bankers, laughing. She lives in a world of books. I live in the real world. The group laughed with him. I became, instantly, the foolish wife who didn't understand her husband's world. I just smiled, that empty, practiced smile I had perfected over 8 years of marriage. The humiliation, however, came in the car on the way home. "What the hell were you thinking?" he hissed, the engine of his Mercedes roaring. "You made me look like an idiot, Eliza. You embarrassed me." "I was just adding to the conversation, Ricardo. The number you quoted was 6 months out of date." "I don't care," he shouted. "Your job is to look pretty and smile. It's not to correct me in front of investors. You're an art history professor, for God's sake. You know nothing about my business." I didn't say anything. I just looked out the window, watching the city lights blur past. He was right. I was an art history professor. I was quiet. I was academic. What my CEO husband, in his arrogance, had never bothered to find out, was my maiden name. The name I stopped using when I married him. He didn't know that the art professor was, in fact, Dr. Eliza Van Hess, the only daughter of Alistair Van Hess. He didn't know that the anonymous Swiss investment fund that held 60% of the voting shares in Novatech Solutions was my family's trust. And he definitely didn't know that the Alistair Van Hess he was so desperate to impress at the luxury board meeting in Zurich next week was my father, and that my father never attended meetings. He always sent me in his place. Ricardo thought that night was embarrassing. He had no idea what real embarrassment was. My name is Eliza, and I was about to turn my husband's luxury board meeting into his worst nightmare. But I need to go back to the beginning. 8 years ago. I need to explain how we got to that point. Ricardo's cruelty at that gala didn't come from nowhere. It was built, brick by brick, over a marriage that was, for me, a partnership, and for him, a performance. I met Ricardo in university. I was there on a full scholarship, finishing my doctorate in art history. My focus was specific, 17th century finance and provenance. I didn't just study the paint on the canvas, I studied the money behind it. How great art collections were used as debt collateral, how financial empires were built on beauty. My brain has always run on 2 tracks, the beauty of art and the brutal logic of the numbers behind it. Ricardo was there getting his MBA. He didn't need to be. He was a legacy, the heir to Novatech Solutions. For him, university was a rite of passage, a place to make contacts and solidify his position. He was charming, undeniably. He had that easy, loud confidence that comes from a lifetime with no consequences. He saw me in the library, the quiet scholarship kid buried in books, and he treated me like a project, a challenge. I've never dated a girl who knew the difference between Manet and Monet. He laughed on our first date. It's adorable. What I never told him was why I was there. I was a Van Hess. My father, Alistair Van Hess, is a man who values anonymity above all else. He spent his life building a financial empire in Zurich, and his #1 rule was, never let them know who you are. He despised the new money who plastered their names on buildings. He despised fortune hunters. He raised me to be invisible. When I went to university, it was under one condition. I would use my mother's maiden name, Hesse. I would live on my scholarship. I would find my value in my work, not my name. Being an art history professor wasn't a disguise. It was the real anonymous life I chose. Ricardo knew none of this. To him, I was Eliza Hesse. Smart, exotic, but most importantly, poor. I fell in love with him. or at least the idea of him. I was tired of being the invisible girl. Ricardo was loud. He was seen. He was confident. He wanted to show me off to the world. I confused his desire to display me with pride. Only years later did I realize it was just ownership. When he proposed, I said yes. And then, the first real humiliation. A month before the wedding, I was summoned to his father, Arthur's office. Ricardo was there, looking slightly uncomfortable, staring at his phone. "Eliza," Arthur said, blunt and cold. "We like you. But Ricardo is the future of Novatech. Business is business. We need to protect the family legacy." His lawyer, a man with a heavy gold watch, put a document on the table. A prenuptial agreement. It was a thick document, some 30 pages. I started to read it. The terms were humiliating. It detailed every penny of their fortune. It stipulated that in the event of a divorce, I would be entitled to almost nothing, that I could not claim any shares in Novatech, that I was, in essence, signing that I understood my place. I kept reading, page by page. Ricardo's lawyer looked impatient. Ricardo was checking emails. I had to force myself not to laugh. The vast fortune they were protecting was a fraction of my own trust fund. Their contract was a small-town joke, drafted by country club lawyers. My father, Eliza Van Hess, had made me sign my first trust agreement when I was 18. The lawyers who drafted that document managed nations. I finished reading. I picked up the expensive pen they offered me. And under their shocked gaze, I signed it, without a single question, without calling my own lawyer. The relief in the room was palpable. Arthur smiled, slapped Ricardo on the back. "Smart girl," he said. They interpreted my quick signature as weakness, as the admission of a poor girl who knew she had no bargaining power. Ricardo kissed me on the cheek. "Thanks for making that easy, darling." The irony was almost suffocating. I signed that prenup because honestly it was adorable, and because it protected me. By signing that I wanted nothing of his fortune, I was legally protecting my vast fortune from any future claim by him. They thought they were putting me in a cage. They didn't know I was on the outside, locking the door. I married him. I became Eliza Hesse Santos. I became the art professor. And for 8 years, I played the part perfectly. Novatech Solutions was not his family's company. It was my family's. Years before I met Ricardo, Novatech had been on the verge of bankruptcy. His father was a terrible manager. My father, Alistair, saw an opportunity. The Van Hess Fund bought 60% of the voting shares for pennies on the dollar. My father didn't want to run a tech company. He installed Ricardo's father as a puppet CEO, under one condition: the Van Hess Fund would hold a board seat and have total audit control. Ricardo's father never met my father. Communication was always handled through Swiss lawyers. When Ricardo took over as CEO, he inherited this arrangement. He knew that 60% of his company was owned by an anonymous, all-powerful Swiss fund. He knew his job depended on impressing this shadow shareholder. What he didn't know was that the official representative of that fund, the person who received the confidential quarterly reports, the person with the voting power, was me, his art professor wife. For 8 years, I lived 2 lives. By day, I was Eliza, the academic. I taught, I lectured, and at night, I would sit in my home office, which Ricardo never entered. "Smells like old books," he'd say, and I would read the Novatech reports. The real reports, not the sanitized ones he presented to the public. And they were horrifying. Ricardo wasn't just arrogant. He was dangerously incompetent. I saw it in the first 6 months of our marriage. I was in bed, reading, when he burst in. It was 2 a.m. "Eliza! Eliza!" He was sweating, despite the air conditioning. "You have to help me." "What is it, Ricardo?" "The quarterly report, for the investors. The numbers don't add up. I don't know what I did wrong, but it's showing a $10 million loss. Dad is going to kill me. He's going to fire me." He was head of the growth division at the time. I sighed. I put down my book. I went to his study. The place smelled of Red Bull and panic. I looked at his spreadsheet. It took me less than 5 minutes to see the error. "Ricardo," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "you're calculating your cost of goods sold after applying the value-added tax, not before. You're inflating your loss by 20%. He stared at the screen, uncomprehending. "What?" I spent the next 3 hours. 3 hours in the middle of the night. I didn't just fix the error. I restructured the debt. I found inefficiencies in his supply chain. I rewrote his executive summary, replacing his pompous language with concrete facts. At 5 a.m., the report was perfect. "It's done," I said, exhausted. He hugged me, his relief making him almost childlike. "You saved my life, Eliza. You're a genius. What would I do without you?" The following weekend, we were at a barbecue at his parents' house. I heard Ricardo, laughing with his father, telling the story. "It was incredible, Dad. I was there, 2 a.m., and suddenly, click, I saw it all. A creative tax inefficiency in the COGS calculation. I rewrote the report myself, saved the division. Sometimes you just need a little pressure for your genius to shine." I was standing there, holding a tray of drinks, and he didn't even look at me. He had absorbed my work, my knowledge, and regurgitated it as his own. That was the first brick. And so it went. For 8 years, I was his invisible safety net. I was the art professor who secretly ensured his incompetence didn't sink the ship, until he was named CEO, and his incompetence outgrew my ability to quietly fix it. I started to see the real fraud about a year ago. He was getting sloppy. I was in my home office reading the real Novatech reports, the ones that went to the Van Hess Fund, and I saw it, $40 million. A capital expenditure line item for something called the Innovation Lab. My blood ran cold. I knew every asset in that company. There was no Innovation Lab. I made a call to Zurich, to Jorgen, my father's chief auditor. "Jorgen," I said, "I need you to look into something for me." Quietly. It took 48 hours. He called me back. "Dr. Van Hess," he said, his voice always calm. "The Innovation Lab is a shell company registered in Austin, Texas. The payments were made, but the end beneficiaries are not vendors. The money was traced to an account in the Cayman Islands and then back to a private account in New York." "Whose account?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's your husband's, Dr. Van Hess, registered to Ricardo Santos." I hung up. He wasn't just being incompetent. He wasn't just taking credit for my work. He was actively stealing. Stealing from my father. Stealing from me. It was 3 days after this discovery. 3 days that I spent walking around my own house, looking at the man I slept next to as if he were a stranger. That Ricardo took me to the fundraising gala. It was 3 days after I discovered he was a thief, that he had the audacity to pat my hand in front of those bankers, tell me I lived in a world of books, and call me embarrassing. He thought that was his moment of triumph. I, on the other hand, was already mentally drafting the summons for the Zurich board meeting. It was in that moment, in the car, as he was yelling about how I had humiliated him, that I decided to stop being an observer and become the owner. That night, after the gala, Ricardo was exultant. The humiliation he'd dealt me seemed to inflate his ego. He came home whistling, poured another whiskey, and slapped me on the back while I, from force of habit, was loading the dishwasher. "See, darling? That's how the real world works," he said, his voice slurring from the alcohol and self-satisfaction. "A little charm, a little power. Those bankers loved me. They don't even remember your," he made a vague gesture, "your little correction. Forget about it." He went to bed, drunk on whiskey and self-importance, and fell asleep in seconds, snoring. He was a man without doubt and without depth, a man who never worried about looking down to see who he was stepping on. I waited. I heard his snores deepen, settling into a rhythmic, annoying sound. I heard the grandfather clock in the hall chime 1 a.m. I dried my hands, methodically. I folded the dish towel and placed it on the counter. I closed the dishwasher. Each action was deliberate. I was closing the door on my old life. I went upstairs, but I didn't turn toward our bedroom. I went to my office, the place he called the dusty book room. Ricardo was wrong. It didn't smell like old books. It smelled of quality archive paper, of beeswax, and the faint ozone tang of my encrypted data terminal. It was the smell of facts, of truth. I sat at my desk, a solid 19th century oak piece that had been my grandfather's. The scent was comforting. It was my world. I looked at the Novatech Q3 report. $40 million. Siphoned off to an innovation lab that, I knew from my own digging, consisted of a luxury office in Austin and two of Ricardo's college friends who were collecting six-figure salaries to think creatively. It was fraud, pure and simple. He was stealing my family's money, and he had the audacity to call me embarrassing. I opened my secure laptop. Not the MacBook Ricardo had given me for Christmas, which probably had some kind of spyware on it, but my own encrypted system that I used to manage the fund. And I made the call. The screen flickered, and my father's face, Eliza Van Hess, appeared. It was 7 a.m. in Zurich. He was already in his office, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. His eyes were clear, blue, and showed no emotion. He was reading a document. He didn't say hello. He just looked up from the paper. Eliza. It was an acknowledgement. Father, I replied. It's Ricardo. Alistair didn't even blink. He just waited. He is the most patient man I have ever known. The Q3 report you received was correct, I said. 40 million siphoned to a vanity project. But it's worse than that. He's cooking the books to hide operational losses in 3 other divisions. The company is bleeding, and he's using capital funds to plug the holes, hoping the market will turn. Alistair let out a slow sigh, the only sign of irritation he allows. Incompetence I can tolerate, Eliza. It generates buying opportunities. But fraud is tedious, and it's a risk. I agree, I said. And on a personal level, he has become loud. He humiliated me publicly tonight, in front of several investment bankers. He mocked my world of books. He told me I was embarrassing. For the first time, my father's eyes narrowed. It was a minimal shift, almost imperceptible. But to me, it was a thunderclap. He said what? He's arrogant, father. He believes he is Novatech. He has forgotten he is an employee. He has forgotten he is a puppet CEO, managing our money. Alistair was silent for a long moment. He looked at something off-screen, organizing his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was as cold as the alpine air. The Van Hess Fund does not tolerate thieving employees, and the Van Hess family does not tolerate being called embarrassing, he continued. The company bylaws, which my team drafted when we bought the debt, require an extraordinary board meeting to approve any 5-year plan. He is late in presenting his. I know, I said. He's desperate to present. He thinks it will secure his future. He thinks he will impress you. Good, Alistair said. Let's schedule it, in Zurich, next week. The luxury board meeting, as he likes to call it. Let him think it's his big chance. Let him think I will be there. You won't be, I affirmed. Of course not, he said with a hint of disdain. I have real work to do. You will go. You will chair the meeting. The bylaws allow me to name a proxy with my full voting power. You are Dr. Eliza Van Hess. You are the beneficial owner of the trust. It is time for Mr. Santos to meet his real boss. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight and power of that moment. He will panic when he sees me. No, my father corrected. He won't. Not immediately. He won't recognize you. His mind is incapable of connecting the art professor wife with Dr. Van Hess. He will walk into that room expecting to see me, and he will find his academic wife sitting in the chair. Let him sweat. Let him think it's some kind of protocol error. Let him give his pathetic presentation. And then, when he is finished, you destroy him. The plan was cold. It was brutal. And it was perfect. I will arrange the summons, I said. Do it, my father said. And Eliza, do not call him Ricardo. In that room, he is not your husband. He is a poorly performing employee. Call him Mr. Santos." The call ended. It took 2 days to arrange. The official summons came from my father's law firm in Geneva. It was not an email. It was a physical document, delivered by special courier. I knew exactly when it would arrive. I was in my home office pretending to read a book when I heard Ricardo's car come screeching into the driveway, far earlier than usual. It was 4 p.m. He slammed the front door. The sound echoed through our silent home. "Eliza!" I did not move. I waited. He burst into my office. I had never seen him so euphoric. He was pale, but his eyes were shining with a manic light. He was holding a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It had a wax seal. "You will not believe this," he shouted, waving the envelope. "Do you know what this is?" "It looks like an invitation, dear," I said calmly. "An invitation? Eliza? It's a summons. From Zurich. From Eliza Van Hess himself. The most reclusive man in finance. He has summoned me. He wants to meet me." He was practically dancing. It was pathetic. He was like a puppy, finally being called by its master. "He's calling me to the board meeting in Zurich. Next week. This is it. This is the big one, Eliza. The whale. He's finally going to meet me. He's going to see my vision for the company." He grabbed my shoulders. "He's probably going to make me a partner. He's going to remove that stupid 60% cap and give me full control. He sees what I'm doing." "That's wonderful, Ricardo," I said, my empty smile firmly in place. "Wonderful? It's everything," he said. "I need a new suit. Several. And you—" His euphoria suddenly switched to that familiar disdain. "You need new clothes. You can't embarrass me in Zurich. We'll buy you something. Something that doesn't look—" He gestured to my cashmere sweater. "Like that." "Of course, dear. Actually," he said, already thinking aloud, "it's better if you stay at the hotel. This is a very high-level meeting. It's not a place for, I don't want you to feel out of place." "I don't mind coming, Ricardo. I can sit in the corner quietly." He laughed. That same laugh from the gala. No, better not. I'll handle the real world. You stick to your books. But don't worry, I'll bring you back some expensive Swiss chocolate." He ran out of the room, yelling into his phone at his assistant, telling her to cancel all his meetings and book the company jet. He spent the next 4 days locked in his study. He was preparing for the biggest presentation of his life. I heard him rehearsing his speech at night. He was preparing charts. He was practicing jokes. He was most likely practicing his handshake in the mirror. He was polishing the brass, thinking it was gold. I watched him go. I helped him pack. "Are you sure you don't want me to come?" I asked, feigning innocence, as I folded one of his expensive shirts. "Absolutely sure, darling," he said, kissing the top of my head. "It would be so boring for you, just numbers and strategy, CEO stuff. You wouldn't even understand the conversation." "You're right," I said. "I'll stay home and read." What he didn't know was that my flight, on my father's private jet, was leaving 2 hours after his. He was flying to a presentation. I was flying to an acquisition. The week of the meeting was the performance of my life. I played the part of the nervous, supportive wife. "Are you sure this chart looks good, Eliza?" Ricardo would ask, adjusting his tie in the mirror of our lavish hotel suite. "It shows the 40% growth in the innovation lab." "It looks beautiful, dear," I said, knowing he was proudly showing off his own fraud numbers. "God, I'm so nervous," he said, which was a lie. He was vibrating with arrogance. "Eliza Van Hess, the man himself. If I can impress him today, Eliza, the sky's the limit. He's going to hand me the kingdom." I just smiled and straightened his hair. "You'll be great, Ricardo." The meeting was set for 10 a.m. At the Van Hess Fund headquarters, a black glass building that seemed to suck in the sunlight. Ricardo was glowing. He was in his best $10,000 Italian suit. His $50,000 watch, bought with Novatech money, of course, was gleaming. He smelled of confidence and expensive cologne. I was myself. I wore a simple gray high-necked dress. My hair was in a tight bun. I wore my professor glasses. I looked exactly what he thought I was, the dowdy, unimportant academic wife he was dragging along. "Okay, darling," he said in the elevator, adjusting his cuffs. "When we get up there, I need you to be quiet. Very quiet. Do not say a word unless someone speaks to you directly, and if they do, you just smile and say how brilliant you think I am. Got it? No numbers, no opinions. Do not embarrass me. Not today. I understand perfectly, Ricardo." The elevator opened onto the top floor, a vast, white, silent office. A receptionist looked up. "Good morning. We are here for the 10 a.m. meeting with Mr. Van Hess. I am Ricardo Santos, CEO of Novatech." The receptionist, a woman named Greta, whom I had known for 10 years, looked at her list, then at me, and back to Ricardo. "Mr. Santos, yes," she said, her Swiss accent flawless. "But the meeting is not with Mr. Van Hess." Ricardo's confidence wavered for a second. "What?" "The summons came from him. I was told he would be here." "I'm afraid not, sir," Greta said. "Mr. Van Hess never attends these reviews. He sends his official board representative. She is already waiting for you. This way, please." Ricardo was visibly annoyed. He had been promised a king and was getting a representative. He huffed, but followed Greta down the hall. I followed him, 2 steps behind, the obedient shadow. We reached a massive oak door. Greta opened it. "The chairwoman is ready for you," she said. Ricardo walked into the conference room. It was a cavernous room, dominated by a single 30-foot black slate table. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the snow-capped Alps. At the far end of the table, in a single chair, sat a woman. Her back was to the door. She was looking out the window. Where is she?" Ricardo asked, confused. "I'm right here, Ricardo," I said. I hadn't walked in behind him. I had walked in beside him, and while he was staring at the empty head of the table, I walked calmly down the length of it. Ricardo turned, his face a mask of total confusion. "Eliza, what the hell are you doing? Get away from there! Sit down!" I didn't stop. I kept walking until I reached the head of the table. The woman who had her back to us stood up. It was my father's executive assistant, Helga. "Good morning, Dr. Van Hess," Helga said. "Good morning, Helga," I replied. I took off my professor glasses. I took off my gray cardigan, revealing a sharp, expensive black dress Ricardo had never seen. Helga took my coat. I sat down. In the chair, Ricardo was frozen in the middle of the room. He was looking at me, at Helga, at the empty place settings. He looked like a man who had walked into the wrong house. "Eliza, what kind of joke is this?" he said, forcing a nervous laugh. "You're sitting in the chairman's seat. Get up. Get up now before he gets here." "He isn't coming, Ricardo," I said. My voice was not the wife voice. It was the voice I used when I lectured. Cold, clear, authoritative. And this is not a joke. Helga began distributing binders to the empty seats. "Ricardo," I said, "please sit. We have a full agenda. And stop calling me Eliza. In this room to you, I am Dr. Van Hess." His face, it changed. The color didn't just drain. It was vacuumed out. His nervous smile froze, then cracked, then collapsed. "Van Hess?" he stammered. Like Alistair Van Hess? "He is my father," I said, opening my own binder. "I am the sole beneficiary of the Van Hess Family Trust. The trust that, as you know, holds 60% of the voting shares in your company. I am the shadow shareholder you've been so desperate to impress. I am the person who has been reading your fraudulent financial reports for the last 2 years. And I am the person you, 3 days ago, in front of a dozen bankers called embarrassing." He didn't move. He couldn't breathe. What? He tried to say. "Please," I said, and my voice was steel. I pointed to the single, armless steel chair placed 10 feet away from the table, the chair reserved for low-level assistants. "Sit, Mr. Santos. We are wasting precious time." He stumbled to the chair. He didn't sit. He collapsed onto it. His $10,000 suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. "Helga," I said, "please begin the recording. Extraordinary Board Meeting of Novatech Solutions, October 15th. In attendance, Dr. Eliza Van Hess, Chairwoman and Majority Representative. Mr. Ricardo Santos, CEO. I looked at him, down that vast black slate table. "Mr. Santos, I understand you have a presentation," I said. "On your vision for the next 5 years. Please proceed. We are all very eager to hear it." It was the longest hour of his life. He stood. His hands were shaking so much he could barely connect his laptop. He dropped the connector on the floor. He fumbled. He tried to start his rehearsed presentation. "Thank you, Dr. Van Hess." He stammered. I am here today to talk about synergy and the future." It was a disaster. The man who was all bluster and arrogance in front of bankers was now a stammering boy being scolded by the principal. I let him speak. I watched him click through his fraudulent charts. I watched him lie about the $40 million innovation lab. His voice was high and cracking. He was sweating profusely, staining the collar of his silk shirt. I waited until he was done. He stood there, silent, trembling, waiting for me to say something. "Thank you, Mr. Santos," I said, my voice cold. "That was illuminating. I have a few questions." I opened my binder. Page 4, the Innovation Lab. "Can you explain why the $40 million payments were made to an entity called Apex Solutions, which, our records show, is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands?" Ricardo's face went chalk white. I don't... That's a tax strategy." "A tax strategy? Interesting. Because my forensic audit team," I gestured to the adjoining room where I knew Jorgen was listening, "traced those payments. They didn't stay in the Caymans, did they, Mr. Santos? They were routed back to a private account in Milan, an account registered to a one Isabella Rossi. Can you tell us who Ms. Rossi is? Is she a tax strategy?" He said nothing. He just shook his head, defeated. "She's your mistress, Ricardo. You weren't just incompetent. You're a thief. You have been stealing from my family, stealing from me, to finance your second life. And page 10, I continued relentlessly. Your projected growth for the renewable energy division, the number you quoted at the gala, the number you told me I wouldn't understand. Can you explain why that number is double what your own division managers reported in their internal memos? Memos which I happen to have right here." I slid a stack of papers down the black table. His own internal reports. He looked at the papers. He looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The anger was gone. All that was left was terror. "Eliza, please," he whispered. "Dr. Van Hess," I corrected, my voice cutting the silence. "Mr. Santos, your job here is not vision. Your job is to manage my father's company. And you are not just being incompetent. You are being fraudulent." I closed my binder. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "Alistair Van Hess does not tolerate thieves, Ricardo. And I do not tolerate being called embarrassing by my lowest performing employee. What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice a thread. "As the majority shareholder," I said, "I am exercising the gross misconduct clause in your employment contract. As of this moment, you are terminated as CEO." "No. Eliza, please. You can't." "I already have. Helga, please notify security. Mr. Santos is to have no further access to his offices or accounts." I stood up. The meeting was over. Are you divorcing me?" he asked, looking like a lost child. I walked toward him, stopping so he had to look up at me. "Oh, the divorce?" I laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Ricardo, weren't you paying attention 8 years ago? I signed the prenup. The one your father forced on me. The one that says I don't want a penny of your money. You can have the car. You can have the condo. I don't care." I leaned in. "I don't want your money, Ricardo. I want my company." I turned and walked toward the door. But where do I go?" he panicked. "What do I do? My cards." I paused at the door and looked back at the man who, 72 hours ago, had told me I lived in a world of books. Honestly, Ricardo, I said, I don't care. I walked out. His nightmare had just begun. The victory in Zurich was the end of Ricardo. But it was just the beginning of my nightmare. I had cut the head off the snake, but the body was still full of venom. Ricardo wasn't just an incompetent CEO. He was a cancer that had metastasized throughout the company. When I returned to the main Novatech headquarters, I didn't enter as a conquering heiress. I entered as a surgeon entering an emergency room. The company was bleeding out. Jorgen's forensic audit team, who flew with me from Zurich, confirmed my worst fears. The Apex fraud and the $40 million innovation lab were just the start. Ricardo had leveraged the company with short-term, high-interest loans to cover operational losses he was hiding from the board. And thus, from me, he had hired dozens of useless consultants, college friends, and distant relatives, all on six-figure salaries, who did absolutely nothing. Novatech wasn't just having a bad quarter. It was 2 weeks from insolvency. 2 weeks from being unable to make payroll. My father called me on the second night I was there. I was in Ricardo's old office, surrounded by stacks of fraudulent reports at 3 a.m. Eliza, Alistair said, his voice calm. Your audit team sent me the preliminary report. The hole is $90 million, deeper than we thought. My team in Zurich advises liquidation. Sell the assets, shut it down. It's the cleanest move. You get your initial investment back and come home. I looked out Ricardo's window. I could see the factory floor below, lights still on where the actual engineers worked, men and women who had nothing to do with Ricardo's fraud, people who, like me, had been lied to. No, I said. There was a silence on the line. No, my father repeated. Ricardo and his father spent 20 years running this company's name into the ground. If I liquidate now, 200 people lose their jobs because of one incompetent man. I won't do it. I won't let his legacy be my only option. It will be hard, Eliza. It will be expensive. Saving this will cost you money. Your money. I know, I said. But my family's name is on it. And I don't lose. I will restructure. I will clean house. I hung up. The first week was a bloodbath. I fired 25 VPs of Synergy and directors of strategic innovation. All of them were Ricardo's golf buddies. The screaming was immense. They threatened to sue. I told them to do it. And that when they did, my legal department would be happy to countersue, presenting their fraudulent expense reports and lack of timesheets as evidence. They went silent. I promoted the people Ricardo had ignored. The head of logistics he had called a boring functionary. The chief engineer he had said lacked vision. I gave them the power they deserved. And then, in the middle of this chaos, I had to deal with my personal life. The first call was from my divorce lawyer. I had hired the best. Eliza, she said. Good news. The prenup his father made you sign is a work of art. It protects you perfectly. He waives all claim to any trust or inheritance assets. You owe him nothing. In fact, he owes you. How so? I asked. The Milan apartment? The one he bought for his mistress? He bought it with corporate funds which, we now know, belong to you. The court sees that as dissipation of marital assets. Not only does he get nothing, but the value of that apartment will be deducted from any settlement he might have gotten. The man literally paid for his own divorce with the money he stole from you. The second visit wasn't as clean. I was in my new office, Ricardo's old one, which I'd had painted white and emptied of all his heavy mahogany furniture, when my assistant buzzed, pale. Dr. Van Hess, there's a woman here to see you. She says she's Ricardo's mother. She doesn't have an appointment. Send her in, I said, not looking up from my reports. The door flew open. Ricardo's mother, Beatrice, stormed in like a hurricane. A woman who lived on charity luncheons and scorn. Eliza, she shrieked, her voice echoing in the minimalist office. What have you done? What have you done to my son? I calmly closed my laptop. Beatrice, please sit. I will not sit, she spat. You've destroyed him. You and your dirty money. You humiliated him. His father is a wreck. Our family name—" "Your family name?" I stood up, and for the first time, I was not the scared daughter-in-law. I was the chairwoman. "Beatrice, your family name was on its way to bankruptcy. Your husband and your son were stealing from my family. They used this company as their personal ATM to fund their pathetic lives." She gasped. How dare you?" "I dare because I've read the receipts," I said, my voice cold. "I've seen the Milan apartment your son bought for his mistress. I've seen the jewelry invoices he filed as office expenses. He is not a victim. He is a common thief. And frankly, he is lucky I haven't had him arrested. He is your husband," she cried. "He was my husband. And for 8 years, I was the embarrassing art professor wife. I endured his scorn. I endured your family's scorn." I smiled and looked pretty, just like he told me to. I walked up to her. "You were at that gala, Beatrice. You laughed. You laughed when he told me I lived in a world of books. You laughed when he told me I was embarrassing." I stood inches from her. "Tell me, Beatrice, who's embarrassed now?" She had no answer. She looked at me, the woman she had dismissed as nothing, and saw the woman who now owned everything she had. "Get out of my office," I said. "Get out of my building." She left, not like a hurricane, but like a ghost. The cleanup was almost done. I had purged the fraud. I had purged the family. Now, all that was left was to fix the company. I called an all-hands meeting, 200 employees. I stood on the stage, not as Ricardo's wife, not as a Swiss heiress, but as myself. "Good morning," I said. "My name is Eliza Van Hess, and as of today, I am the new CEO and chairwoman of Novatech. And I know you're scared. You've read the reports. You know this company is on the brink. I won't lie to you. The previous management, the management of Ricardo Santos and his father, was negligent, arrogant, and criminal. But I did not take over this company to liquidate it. I took it over because I believe in the engineers. I believe in the designers. I believe in the people who, like me, were ignored by loud men who think vision is the same as work. There will be cuts, but we are not cutting the workers. We are cutting the fat. We are cutting the vanity projects. We are cutting the luxury offices. We are going back to doing what this company did best: building. Ricardo Santos told me I lived in a world of books. He was right. And in my books, the numbers have to add up, and the villains always lose. The work starts now. Let's save this company. 3 years have passed since the day I expelled Ricardo from the Zurich lobby. I didn't save Novatech. Novatech, the company of Ricardo and his father, was dead. It was a rotten shell, built on lies and ego. I dismantled it. I sold off the toxic assets, closed the fraudulent divisions, and fired every useless consultant Ricardo had hired. And from those ashes, I built something new. I rebranded the company as Vantage Innovations. I didn't step in as CEO. I'm not a CEO. I'm an academic. I'm a strategist. I am the owner. I hired a real CEO, a brilliant woman from Singapore, whom Ricardo had once dismissed as too aggressive, to run the day-to-day. I became what I was always meant to be, the chairwoman of the board. The one who reads the reports, the one who understands the numbers, and the one who makes the real decisions. The company isn't just profitable, it's stable. It's growing. Because it's built on facts, not on one man's arrogance. And the divorce. Oh, the divorce was almost comical. Ricardo, in a final, pathetic act of desperation, tried to contest the prenup. We sat in a sterile mediation room. He looked aged, 10 years older. His suit was wrinkled. He looked weak. His lawyer, a man who looked as tired as his rumpled suit, began to argue. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Santos, was induced into this marriage under false pretenses. Dr. Van Hess committed marital fraud by willfully concealing her identity and her vast fortune. Mr. Santos entered this marriage believing he was marrying an academic of modest means. This deception nullifies the prenup and entitles Mr. Santos to an equitable division of her assets." I almost laughed. The man who called me poor and embarrassing was now demanding half my fortune because I wasn't poor enough. My lawyer, Miranda, didn't even flinch. She let him finish his long, pathetic speech. When he was done, Miranda leaned forward. "So, let me be clear," Miranda said, her voice cutting. "Your client, Mr. Santos, is suing my client, Dr. Van Hess, because she wasn't poor enough for him? Because he didn't know how rich the woman he was publicly humiliating and cheating on was? Is that your legal argument?" The mediator almost choked. Ricardo's lawyer started to stammer about fiduciary duty in a marriage. Miranda cut him off. "The prenup that your client and his father forced on mine," she gestured to me, "is a work of art. It's ironclad, and it's bilateral. It states she waives all claim to his assets, and he waives all claim to her assets. He protected himself from her, and in doing so, he protected her from him." "But my assets," Ricardo finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "My assets are frozen. She took my company. She took the debt of the company, Mr. Santos," Miranda corrected. "A company you were actively defrauding. And as for your personal assets," she opened a binder. "The court has already agreed that the $4 million Milan apartment, which you purchased for your mistress, Ms. Rossi, with stolen corporate funds, is considered dissipation of marital assets. The full value of that apartment will be deducted from any settlement you might have received. You not only get nothing, you are in debt to the estate. You literally paid for your own divorce with the money you stole." Ricardo sank in his chair. I looked at him. "You get nothing, Ricardo." He walked out of that marriage exactly as he had entered it, with nothing but his name. And now, even the name Santos, associated with the Novatech fraud, was toxic. I hadn't seen him since that day in court. I had no idea what had happened to him, until last week. I was at my old university, not as the embarrassing art professor, but as the primary donor of the new Van Hess Center for Art and Technological Provenance, a center dedicated to using data analysis, my specialty, to track stolen art. It was the perfect marriage of my world of books and the real world. I had just given the dedication speech. The hall was filled with academics, museum curators, and, yes, the investment bankers who now managed the center's endowment. The dean was thanking me profusely. "Dr. Van Hess, your support is transformative," he was saying. "Your father must be so proud." "My father is proud, Mr. Dean," I said. "He's happy I finally found a practical use for my doctorate." We laughed. As we walked out of the auditorium and into the grand hall for the reception, we passed a catering crew cleaning up dirty dishes, and that's when I saw him. He wasn't a guest. He was staff. He was wearing a generic black uniform from the university's catering company, a ill-fitting vest and a crooked bow tie. He was pushing a tall metal cart, stacking dirty plates and half-drunk glasses of champagne. He looked old. It wasn't just 2 years. It was 20. The arrogance that had held him upright was gone, and what was left was a weak, gaunt man, his shoulders slumped, his eyes empty. He was heading toward the service kitchen, pushing the heavy cart. Our eyes met. He froze. The cart stopped rolling. A glass tumbled from the tray and shattered on the marble floor. The sharp sound made several people turn. His face went through an agony of emotions. Shock, shame, rage, and finally, the most pathetic of all, fear. He opened his mouth, as if to say something. My name, perhaps. Eliza. I didn't stop walking. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I simply looked through him, as if he was exactly what he was, an invisible member of the staff, pushing a cart. Someone who didn't belong in my world. I turned back to the dean, who had paused at the sound of the glass. Don't worry, I said to him. Just a broken glass. I continued my conversation about the endowment. I believe data analysis is the future, Mr. Dean. It's where the real world and the academic world meet. I heard him start to push the cart again, behind me. The sound of the squeaking wheels on the marble floor was the only sound he made. On the flight back to Zurich, in my jet, I thought about that night, 2 years ago. The night Ricardo told me I lived in a world of books while he lived in the real world. He was right. His real world was an illusion. It was a privilege bubble, built with my family's money, his lies, and an arrogance he'd never earned. It was a house of cards, and he was nothing more than a jester wearing the king's crown. My world of books? My books taught me that numbers don't lie. My books taught me how to trace fraud across continents. My books taught me that knowledge isn't just power, it's ownership. Ricardo thought I was embarrassing. He laughed at me. He never realized that, in the real world, the academic who actually reads the books will always own the fool who only signs them. Thank you for listening to my story. If you believe that knowledge is the true power and that arrogance is just a mask for incompetence, show your support by liking this video. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of justice being served. And finally, if you know someone who needs to be reminded that the world of books always wins, share this story with them.